Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to the Center for Presidential History, Dallas Hall, and Dedman College. Thank you for coming out for yet another in our discussions of presidential memoir and history. We're very excited to have our speaker here tonight. Let me tell you, before we get to him, a few things that we have coming up just to mark on your calendars. Of course, you can always find the information on our schedule on our website. But I wanted to point out in particular a couple that are coming up, which I think are particularly exciting. On April 10th, we are going to have Marie Griffith from the Danforth Center at Washington and St. Louis, who has published a brilliant book which also has a completely non-provocative title, Moral Combat: How Sex Divided American Christians and Fractured American Politics. So nothing to talk about. And then also, on the 2nd, I encourage you, we have an evening symposium looking at how it's called When They Come Home, Soldiers in American Society from the Revolution to the War on Terror. This is a program that was actually put together and spearheaded by one of our postdocs, Dr. Lindsay Travinsky, who just recently took a job, which is very exciting for all of us when somebody gets a job, just really recently took a job at the White House Historical Association, and she put together this conference looking at essentially what different generations of soldiers learn overseas and bring back to change American society with that experience, going from the Revolution on through the War on Terror. So I really encourage you to mark that on your calendar. That one's May 2nd. Without further ado, let me turn to our speaker this evening, Daniel Immerwahr from Northwestern University. Daniel has one of those CVs that is intimidating. He has a degree from Columbia University. That's not so great. But thank you. But also was a Marshall Scholar, got another degree from Cambridge University, and then his PhD from Cal Berkeley. His first book won numerous prizes, both from on the intellectual history circuit, also from American foreign relations circuits, and now this new book, How to Hide an Empire. Did I get it right? All right. Has just been getting wonderful, wonderful reviews. But I want to tell you the real reason that we have Daniel here tonight, which is that he received, I don't know, 3 years ago, I guess maybe, an award from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, which is the host organization for those of us who do international history or diplomatic history or foreign relations. We never can decide exactly what the phrase is of what we do. And he won the award for being the most prominent scholar up and coming under the age of 41. I should point out they don't actually pay that much attention to the 41, but I think you made it anyway. Okay, cool. And this is essentially an award that's given to someone just for being brilliant. And I sat in the back of this talk and said to myself, this guy's brilliant. We need to have him up to Dallas. So I'm glad that we finally did, and now he has a book to demonstrate the brilliance both in audio form, and then you can read it later if I don't break his computer. So if you would, please, join me in welcoming our guest, Professor Daniel Immerwahr.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you so much for having me out here. I want to start by telling you the one thing you already know about U.S. history, which is I want to start with the single most famous event probably in the 20th century is the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th. As we often tell it in this country, it's an attack on Pearl Harbor, a military base, a naval base in Hawaii, and it draws the United States into World War II. This has been not just narrated countless times, commemorated in films from Here to Eternity, or more recently Pearl Harbor, terrific film, highly recommended. But there's something that those commemorations and certainly the films tend to leave out, and what they tend to leave out is what happens next. So yes, the Japanese strike Pearl Harbor at Hawaii. But then, within a matter of hours, so this is planned as a kind of simultaneous attack, Japan also attacks the U.S. island Wake Islands, the U.S. inhabited territory of Guam, the single largest colony that the United States holds, which is the Philippines, as well as the British territories of Hong Kong, Malaya, and the independent Kingdom of Thailand. This is a large Pacific blitzkrieg in attempt to remove as much as possible the European empires from the Pacific, to clear the region in a single lightning strike. And that attack on the Philippines, which is the largest US territory, is actually militarily arguably just as damaging as the attack at Hawaii on Pearl Harbor. The attack on the Philippines sort of takes out the Air Force that the United States had been amassing in the Philippines and had been depending on to protect not just the Philippines, but the entire theater. And much of it is wiped out in just a matter of hours. Not only that, as compared to the attack on Pearl Harbor, which is just that, it's an attack. The Japanese attack, they don't attack again, and then the United States ultimately has Hawaii. That's not what happens in the Philippines. There, the Japanese attack, but the initial attack is then followed by an invasion, an occupation, and a sort of years-long occupation of the largest US colony by Japan, a brutal occupation, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It's not entirely clear within those hours after Japan's attack what to call it, how to narrate it, how to say what happened. And in fact, if you look at newspapers from the time that are hastily reporting it, they don't say Pearl Harbor was struck. In fact, that term Pearl Harbor wasn't really lexically available within the newsprint. You don't see Pearl Harbor as the name of what happened until a few days after. So what you see instead is a variety of ways of describing what happened. Japanese strike Guam and Hawaii. The Japanese strike Hawaii and the Philippines. That location, Hawaii and the Philippines, as a way of standing in for the larger attack. That's how Eleanor Roosevelt describes it on her speech that she gives the evening of the attack, before FDR's Date Which Shall Live in Infamy address. That's also how Sumner Welles, who's FDR's trusted Undersecretary of State, drafts FDR's Date Which Shall Live in Infamy address. It's about an attack on Hawaii and the Philippines. FDR rejects Sumner Welles' draft, and he produces his own draft, typed up, and we have that draft. And it, too, describes the attack as an attack on the Philippines and Hawaii. But then FDR contemplates that, and he considers that, and he toys with the draft. We know this because we have all the successive drafts except for the very last one. We can see his markings in pencil, and one thing that you can see is that at a certain point during the day, after this typed draft has been produced, the first draft, FDR crosses out prominent references to the Philippines and sticks with just Hawaii as the place that has been struck. He does mention the Philippines. There's a part at the very end of the speech where FDR lists all the targets that have been struck, and he lists the Philippines among them. But it's an indiscriminate list, and it's in fact a list that does not distinguish between British and US territories. And nevertheless, clearly the emphasis after FDR makes his pencil remarks is on Hawaii. Why? Why does he switch from this is an attack on the Philippines and Hawaii, which is actually a pretty good military description of what had happened, to this is an attack on Hawaii? Well, we don't know, but it seems, I feel comfortable hazarding a guess. It seems to me that FDR is trying to not just militarily describe what has happened, he's trying to produce a call to war. And in doing so, he seems very nervous about listing targets like the Philippines, and I think his nervousness is this. What if my audience, he wonders, doesn't think that the Philippines is part of the United States? What if the Philippines getting attacked doesn't count for the purposes of war? In fact, we have opinion polls from right before Pearl Harbor that ask people in the United States, do you think the United States military should come to the defense of Guam, of the Philippines? And the majority of people say no. In fact, even Hawaii, which is a territory and not a state at this time, it doesn't become a state until 1959, even Hawaii is fairly wobbly in this respect. In 1940, Fortune asks its readers which countries the United States should come to the military defense of if necessary. And only a bare majority, 55%, say the United States should defend Hawaii. People in Hawaii are terrified when they read this. And they're terrified for two reasons. One is, gosh, that number's awfully low. And two, they also object to the wording of this. Countries? Hawaii isn't a country. It's not a foreign country. It's an integral part of the United States, they respond. And in fact, the very wording of the question already is offensive and already sort of sets up Hawaii to be a disposable part of the country. Hawaii at that time, not only is it it's a territory, not a state, it also has a majority non-white population, and that certainly has something to do with the calculation. It seems like FDR was worried about this as well. So not only did he focus things on Hawaii, Hawaii nevertheless had the largest white population of all the territories and was the closest to the mainland, so perhaps it could serve the best as a target that could rally his audience to war. But FDR made one final edit, and we know it. He didn't make it on any of the drafts. He made it between his last draft and when he actually went up to give the speech. And his edit was this. Instead of talking about a Japanese attack on the island of Oahu, he changed it to a Japanese attack on the American island of Oahu, just to make it absolutely clear, because he was nervous about this fact, that Hawaii is part of the United States. Even after this, not everyone totally got that message. Rand McNally, the most sort of largest publisher of maps and atlases, published a wartime atlas, or published a number of wartime atlases. And these kind of atlases sold very well. FDR, enjoying the nation, please follow the war, get out your maps, follow the war on your maps. Here's a page from Rand McNally's wartime ready reference atlas of the world. And I'll just draw your attention to some things. On the list of foreign cities and foreign places, you will find Hawaii, you will find the Philippines, you will find Puerto Rico. I found correspondence from a class of girls, in 7th grade girls, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, who were using this atlas to try to do as the president instructed them, to follow the war. And they saw this, and they were baffled. And, thank God for this teacher who had them do this. They wrote to Rand McNally to ask about this. What are you talking about? Hawaii is foreign. How does the war even make sense if that's true? And Rand McNally responded to them and responded this way. Although Hawaii belongs to the United States, it is not an integral part of this country. It is foreign to our continental shores and therefore cannot logically be shown in the United States proper index. I don't actually know what that means. And I don't think the girls did either, because they wrote back to say, we believe this statement is not true. It is an alibi instead of an explanation. And then they forwarded the entire correspondence to the Department of the Interior, where I found it, and asked for adjudication. And the Department of the Interior wrote back and said, you're absolutely right. Hawaii is part of the United States. Of course you're right. But nevertheless, this confusion bedeviled the United States, not just during World War II, but throughout the 20th century. And to put a name to it, or just to kind of say it in a more abstract way, it's the confusion between thinking that the United States is this. This is the familiar shape that comes to our mind when we map the country in our heads. The political scientist Benedict Anderson called it the logo map, kind of because if the country had a logo, this is kind of what it would look like. Those borders of the country, that shape, corresponds only to the borders of the United States for 3 years of US history. There's 3 years of United States history where those are the actual borders of the country. Before that, as any historian will tell you, the United States started out smaller in the 18th and 19th century. It took until 1854 with the Gadsden Purchase, my favorite of all purchases in US history, before the United States filled out this familiar silhouette. But 3 years later, in 1857, it started expanding overseas. First taking uninhabited islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, then 10 years later taking Alaska, and then just moving on and on. In 1940, or sort of on the eve of Pearl Harbor, I'm going to show you what the United States actually looks like, what the actual borders of the United States looks like are. And I'll tell you, I made this map myself because I couldn't find a map that served these purposes, because what I'm going to show you is the United States, not only all the parts of it, but all the inhabited parts mapped in equal area projections, so you really get a sense of scope. That's what the United States looked like in 1940. Alaska is enormous, would stretch from coast to coast if superimposed over the mainland. I mean, that's what we should call it. That's not the United States, that's the mainland. There are other parts of the country. The Philippines, right there in the middle, is enormous. Actually, Hawaii, if you look at not just the 8 main islands, but the entire string of islands, also would go from coast to coast. I've included smaller little clusters of islands here, Caribbean islands and Pacific islands. These ones on the sides are uninhabited, and these are the only ones I've represented not to scale. I've made them larger just because you could see them. They're so small, otherwise they wouldn't be visible. But everything else is to scale. Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Hawaii, the Philippines, Alaska. And it's not just the physical size of these places that I want you to notice. These are populated places. Here is a list from the 1940 census of the population of the overseas parts of the United States, the parts beyond the mainland. And what you see is, I mean, first of all, it's disproportionate. The Philippines is really large, but other colonies are large as well, other territories are large as well, and overall, nearly 19 million people who live in the United States live not on the mainland, but live in the overseas territories. That's 1 in 8 people who live in the United States. If you live in the United States, at the time of Pearl Harbor, there's a 1 in 8 chance that you are living not on the mainland, but you are living in the overseas parts of the United States. And just for some perspective, that means it is more likely in 1940, if you live in the United States, it is more likely that you are colonized, i.e. living in one of these inhabited territories, than you are African American, by odds of about 3 to 2. That's how many colonial subjects there are in the United States. You are more likely to be colonized than you are to be an immigrant. That's how many colonized subjects there are in the United States. And that's the subject of this book. It's a book I've just published for sale outside. And it's called How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. I'll explain my term in a little bit, but the Greater United States refers to not just the mainland, not just the logo map, but the full United States, all the area over which the United States claims jurisdiction. And the bid of the book, the wager of the book, is that once you take all this territory into consideration, you get a different version of US history. This isn't just a history of the overseas territories. This is a history of the United States, but the greater United States, with all that territory in. And as I found, the overseas parts of the United States are often on the front lines of its history. They're often where some of the most interesting and exciting stuff happens. The book is 22 short chapters, every one of them riveting, and I won't walk you through them all. But I want to talk to you about, I want to tell you just 3 episodes, 3 moments, to give you a sense of the kinds of things you can see when you look not just at the logo map, but at the greater United States. And I'll start with the one moment that is familiar as a history of the greater United States. If you've read a textbook, you will probably have encountered a chapter on 1898, when the United States intervened in a war that Spain was fighting within its empire. And in the end of, the conclusion of that war, the United States claimed from Spain the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. It briefly occupied Cuba, and at the same time, in a sort of imperial shopping spree, it also took the non-Spanish lands of Hawaii and American Samoa. This wasn't the first time the United States has expanded overseas. That has been going on since 1857, but nevertheless, it was a really large moment of expansion, taking not just thinly or populated or uninhabited lands, but taking large populous colonies. And this was, for people living through it, a transformative moment. And just to give you a sense of how transformative it was, I want to show you a map of the United States. Cartographers got really excited in this moment. They were like, ooh, new maps. And they produced new maps of the United States. And a lot of times those maps, published in 1899, published in 1900, looked like this. So you see here not just the mainlands, but you see something that you might never have seen before. When was the last time you saw a map of the United States that had Puerto Rico on it? This was a time when people saw that. And it's not just all the insets that show the Philippines, American Samoa, that show Alaska, badly reduced in size. But also notice something else about this map. The main organizational sort of categorization of this map, the schema of this map, is not the country and then states within it. The main subdivision here, you can see the states, but the main subdivision is moments of annexation. And this isn't just a novelty map. This isn't just a sort of part of the textbook where they're talking about expansion and annexation, so they give you this map. This is a main map of the United States. And what it's arguing is not just that the United States includes all of these places, it's also arguing that the United States is best understood as a dynamic entity. We need to understand expansion as part of what the United States is about, so much so that the divisions that show you the moments of expansion are actually more relevant to the cartographers and their readers than the state divisions. You can also, however, find maps that are like this, that show states, but then show all of the boxes. Again, the size distortion is kind of incredible in some of these cases, but nevertheless, I love how they just sort of like kind of altered the map a little bit just to include Puerto Rico in it. This is a map from 1900. This is the inside front cover of a textbook, of a U.S. history textbook. So if you open your, for reference, you open the textbook and the inside front cover, this is the map of the United States as students saw it, and there are a lot of other maps published like it. This, by the way, is the inside back cover of that textbook, trying the same thing in another way. It's showing the United States, but this time not with the sort of mainland and insets. It's showing the United States spread over the world. It's not quite as impressive because a lot of the places are small islands, but you can see in pink the mainland, Puerto Rico, and then you can see sort of Wake Island, Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Alaska up there. It's a way of showing that the United States has become a different kind of entity. And it's not only cartographers who think that. This is also a time when writers start to rethink the United States and what it means to them. They particularly notice that the name of the country, or what they usually call it, the United States, that doesn't seem to ring quite right anymore, because a lot of them wonder, is Puerto Rico going to be a state? Is the Philippines going to be a state? Maybe United States isn't actually the best name for this. And so they start coming up, trying out other names. Here are the names that come up in the titles of books that I've found. Well, here's one. This is just not a book, but an exposition. The Greater America Exposition. And you can see Uncle Sam engorged, pointing to the new parts of the world that are now part of the United States. But here are some other titles that appear as book titles, not just in the text, but as titles. The Greater Republic, the Greater United States, that's the term I end up using. Oriental America, that's mainly about the Philippines. And 7 books I found that have Greater America in their title or as their title. It goes even further than that. The name of the country is the United States of America. That's the official name of the country. But in the 19th century, it was the way that most people called it was they called it the United States, the Republic, or the Union. They did not largely, they sometimes, but they did not largely call it America, partly because they understood America to refer to the Americas. They did call the people in it Americans, and sometimes they referred to the country as America, but here's how rarely they did. I went through all public speech of sitting presidents, and I tallied it all up from the founding until 1898, and I found 11 unambiguous references by presidents to the United States as America. That's about 1 per decade. It's not that they never use the term, but they don't use it a lot. And if you look at all of the anthems, all of the patriotic songs that are sung about the United States before 1898, well, you'll see a lot of them, including some that are pretty memorable and familiar to us today, including the national anthem today, the Star-Spangled Banner. Not a single one of these songs mentions the word America in its lyrics. If they do mention a literary name for the country, it's Columbia, like the District of Columbia. In fact, 3 of the most sung anthems in the 19th century were Columbia, Hail Columbia, and Columbia, Gem of the Ocean. But the point is, none of them mentioned America in their lyrics. That changes. That changes in 1898, and it changes fairly suddenly. It changes for exactly the same reason that writers are looking for new names for the country. The United States doesn't quite work as well after 1898, but America does. The first president to take office after 1898 is Theodore Roosevelt, who played such a large role in expanding the war and personally fighting it in Cuba himself. I said up to 1898, presidents had used the word America to refer to their country about once per decade. Roosevelt uses it in his first annual message, and then I found a 2-week period in 1903 where in separate speeches he uses it more than every past president had, just like boom, like right there. And everyone after Roosevelt uses that term, as well as the United States, to refer to the country. There are new anthems that are composed in the 20th century. They don't talk about the United States or the Republic or the Union. They talk about America. So this is actually really an incredible seismic shift that happens in the country as a result of its imperial history. It's a kind of interesting moment because it's a moment of clarity. It's a moment when the United States suddenly just appears different. The maps look different. It's a moment that I've been really interested in. It gave me my term that I use, the Greater United States. But it's a moment that doesn't last very long because pretty quickly after that, the maps start reverting back to showing the mainlands, and the United States goes back to conceiving itself as just a republic, despite having quite a large empire. And just to give you some sense of that, I think it's worth comparing the US colonial empire to the British colonial empire. If you're British in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, you are fully aware of the British Empire. This is no secret. In fact, there's a holiday called Empire Day that's celebrated. It starts out in the schools and it becomes an official holiday celebrated nationally in 1916. Actually, I shouldn't say nationally. It's celebrated imperially because it's celebrated throughout the empire. And school children gaze at the map on the wall and they're sort of pointed out all the parts in pink that are British. And then they also dress in national costume of all the colonies that Britain holds. The United States has, amazingly, a similar holiday that is identical in chronology. It starts in the schools, it becomes official in 1916, except with one crucial difference. It's not called Empire Day, it's called Flag Day. And it celebrates not the empire, but explicitly it's designed to celebrate the nation. And the thing that school children look at are not the maps, and by 1916 it's harder to find maps that have all those boxes on them. What they're looking at is the flag, something that has one star for every state, but no representation whatsoever for the territories. If you are British and you're sort of wandering in London, you might come across in Whitehall the Colonial Office and India Office in this massive edifice. This is one way in which Britain communicates to itself the importance of empire within the political structure of Britain. If you're wandering in Washington, D.C., however, well, what will you see? Nothing. There is no U.S. Colonial Office building. There are officials who deal with the empire, but they're always kind of being moved between different departments, and they're always like in the basement or something like that. In 1949, I figured out every person who works in the office that then deals with the U.S. empire, above the clerical level, if you take every one of those people who works in the central office in Washington, it's 10 people. It's 10 underpaid people. So that just gives you a sense of the difference between the United States and Britain, and why I called my book How to Hide an Empire, because there is so many ways in which that moment of 1898 is really not available to us anymore, that the maps look different, that it's hard to see the overseas parts of the United States. And that matters. It matters a lot in history, and it matters for the colonies. One way it matters is that in the 1930s, as it becomes clear that there's a war brewing in the Pacific, Washington does shockingly little to defend its western territories, to prepare them for what everyone thinks is probably going to be a war, partly because these places don't seem to have a lot of purchase. They don't seem to have a lot of claim on leaders in Washington. So it's extremely hesitant to build up its colonial defenses. In fact, the thing that the U.S. government does, the most interesting thing it does to prepare for the possibility of war, is it places the Philippines, its largest colony, on the road to independence, fearing having to defend the Philippines if Japan attacks. that's one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's an important reason, the United States sets the Philippines on a road to independence and explains to the Philippines, when you are independent, we are not defending you, right? We are not, like, once you're no longer U.S. territory, the defense umbrella retracts. So the Philippines has made a commonwealth. It's put on a timetable to independence, and I'll just give you a taste of that because it's a kind of incredible moment. This is the new government that's established, the Commonwealth of the Philippines. This is who's elected the first Philippine president, Manuel Quezon, and he says, okay, great, I am now the president of the Philippines. I want a 21-gun salute, which is appropriate for heads of state. And FDR responds, you can have a 19-gun salute because you're not a head of state. Quezon first threatens to boycott his own inauguration, then he threatens war, and then he backs down and takes the 19 guns. But it's poetic. I mean, it's telling, but it's also poetic because not enough guns would be a theme for the Philippines in the years to come. Once the war starts, Quezon begs the United States for aid and only gets a trickle. The Philippines is far away, it's difficult, but part of the reason it's difficult to provision is the United States has done very little to prepare for the war. And in fact, the United States, the US government, Washington, has adopted a Europe first war strategy, meaning that in terms of temporal priority, who comes first, and also in terms of who matters most, the European theater is the theater that the United States will focus on first, will care the most about, and the Pacific theater will come second. It's not that the United States won't fight in the Pacific, it absolutely does fight in the Pacific, but it will come second. And the implications of this are immediately obvious to Quezon, partly because he can hear FDR's speeches on the radio, and he hears FDR talking about the importance of saving England. And he thinks, England is an imperial power. England is not the United States. The Philippines, Guam, these are actually parts of the United States. He begs Roosevelt for aid, and then he has this very poignant and harsh way of putting it, but I want to share it with you despite its harshness, because I think it gets at a lot of the dilemma that he's considering. This is after Japan has already begun to invade the Philippines, and he's desperate for aid and is not getting any amount that he thinks is sufficient. I cannot stand this constant reference to England, to Europe. I'm here and my people are here under the heels of a conqueror. How typically American to writhe in anguish at the fate of a distant cousin while a daughter is being raped in the back room. That's not just a metaphor. The Japanese occupation is brutal and does involve a lot of sexual assault. He is talking about something real here. Quezon asks then, if he can't get aid, he asks Roosevelt for independence. Because he thinks, okay, if I can get immediate independence, and Douglas MacArthur endorses this plea, then perhaps he thinks I can negotiate with Japan and sort of, they can withdraw the troops, or at least the occupation can be a little easier, and FDR refuses. FDR says, no, the Philippines cannot negotiate with Japan. The Philippines is not an independent country, and moreover, the United States flag will be defended to the death. Those are stirring words, but those are also a fairly accurate prediction. And there's this extraordinary moment in England when the Secretary of State, who had been the Governor General of the Philippines, Henry Stimson, is talking to Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill asks him, vis-a-vis this Europe First strategy, you know what this is going to involve, right? You understand the costs of it, and I just want to make sure, Winston Churchill is thrilled about the Europe First strategy, but he just wants to make sure that the United States is actually willing to pay that cost. And Stimson replies to him, there are times when men have to die, in reference to the Philippines. There are times when men have to die. In essence, the Philippines is going to be a sacrifice zone, is going to buy the United States time so that it can prioritize the European theater, because it genuinely cannot fight two wars fully to the hilt at once. The Japanese occupation is harsh, it's brutal, it's repressive. It mainly involves sort of shunting the Philippine economy into the Japanese war machine, and whenever Filipinos resist, striking back in fairly repressive ways. There are summary executions. Some of them take place as beheadings in the street. There are massacres. But there's one interesting feature, I'll just mention it, which is that Japan also in a desperate bid to get some legitimacy for this harsh military occupation, it also grants the Philippines independence, something that the Philippines hadn't been able to get from the United States. Now, the nature of this independence is extraordinarily qualified. I'll point out the Japanese flag in the background. And the Japanese Army and Navy do not leave the Philippines, and it's quite clear who calls the shots. Nevertheless, it's one attempt of Japan to sort of do the thing that the United States hadn't done in the Philippines. The United States comes back to, quote unquote, liberate its colonies, but of course, liberation isn't going to mean independence, at least not immediate independence. It's going to mean that they're going to be returned to sort of US sovereignty. It first does this in Guam, and the Japanese in Guam have prepared, they've done the thing that the United States hadn't done. They've fortified Guam. And Guam is now going to be much more difficult to take. The Japanese took it in a day. The United States is going to require a lot more than that. And it starts out by shelling and bombing Guamanian targets just to sort of soften it up and to prepare for the invasion. This goes on for 2 weeks. It's a sort of incessant barrage for 2 weeks. And by the time US troops arrive, the capital city, Agana, in Guam has been leveled. 4/5 of Guam's home have been destroyed. And in this time, the Japanese have set out to massacre hundreds of Guamanians as they just sort of realize that there's going to be a fight. The Japanese fairly certain they're going to die in the fight, but they certainly don't want to have to deal with that, a Guamanian stab in the back, and so they just kind of fall on the Guamanian population. And this is a pretty good preview of the kind of thing that might happen when the United States returns to the Philippines, as it does, particularly as it returns to Manila. Manila is at this time the 6th largest city in the United States. It has 1 million people in it. And it's the only major city where the United States engages Japan in World War II on the ground. I mean, there's a lot of bombing of cities, but this is the major city where the United States engages Japan on the ground. And it starts off the way it started in Guam, by bombing Manila, by bombing military targets in Manila to seek to disable the Japanese. This flyer I found captures the logic of that. Filipinos, American planes are bombing and strafing this area. Remember, we don't want to hurt you, but bombs cannot tell friend from foe. Stay away from all military targets, buildings, supply dumps, bridges, and all installations used by the Japs. Keep off the roads. This is a difficult thing. Bombs genuinely cannot tell friend from foe. And the United States seeks to dislodge and disable Japanese forces, but it's doing so in the thickly inhabited areas. And at first in Manila, for the first couple days, it seeks to deal with the Japanese with sort of the artisanal method with small arms fire, and there's some Japanese out there, let's go into the building and fight with rifles in the building. But quickly, a lot of mainland soldiers die. And I mean, it's not a lot compared to the number of Filipinos who have already been dying and are continuing to die, but it's enough for the Army to notice, and particularly for the 37th Infantry Division to notice. That's the lead unit. So it switches to a new strategy, which is just the sort of whole-scale shelling of buildings that are, potentially contain Japanese people in them. The commander, General Beitler, explains it this way. To me, the loss of a single American life to save a building was unthinkable. And said that way, who could disagree, right? This is lives versus architecture. Let's set our priorities straight. But you have to think about what he's actually saying, because those buildings are inhabited. Those buildings contain not just Japanese soldiers and sailors. Those buildings contain Filipinos, and there's Filipinos right near them. This is a thickly populated city, and just outright shelling has a serious cost. Here's some photographs from Manila, just so you get a sense of the scale of destruction in the 6th largest city in the United States, as block after block is turned into a bloody pulp. In a month in Manila, in the Battle of Manila, U.S. mainland deaths amount to, in the U.S. military, amount to about 1,000. Filipino deaths, Filipinos are also U.S. nationals, that's about 100,000. Some of those people are absolutely killed by Japanese. This is not just all from friendly fire, but a lot of Filipinos die, as from the fires, from the buildings collapsing, from the shells entering their homes. overall, and this sort of characterizes the overall reconquest or liberation of the Philippines. In that war, throughout the whole war, but especially at the end, 1.1 million Filipinos die, according to the Philippine government's count. And overall, if you count the Japanese too and the US mainlanders, it's 1.6 million people. That's 2 civil wars. That's the bloodiest event that ever takes place on US soil. It lasts about as long as the Civil War. And that's not the kind of thing that you will often find in textbooks about US history. And part of the reason is, from the perspective of those textbooks, this isn't the United States, right? So this doesn't in some ways count as something that's happening in the United States. One of the more haunting sort of episodes I discovered as I was researching this was I found by the way, this photo sort of slays me every time. It's the looks on their faces, both of their faces, as they sort of contemplate what had just happened in Manila. I found this memoir from someone who'd been a boy. His name is Oscar Villadolid. He's Filipino. He'd been a boy during this, and he had encountered a GI in the aftermath who was going around handing out chocolate. And he said to the GI, "Thank you very much." And the guy responded, was startled, and he said, "How do you speak English?" And Oscar Villadolid said, "Oh, right. When you guys colonized us, you sent over school teachers, and actually the language of instruction in the schools is English, so I grew up speaking English, so that's why I speak English." And then the GI is even more baffled, says Villadolid, because he didn't realize that the Philippines had been colonized by the United States. In other words, this guy had gone across the Pacific, seen who knows what kind of combat, possibly his comrades die, been given maps, been told whom to shoot and why, and at no point had it dawned on him that he was fighting to liberate US territory. He thought he was invading a foreign country, even after all that. And I've looked at the pamphlets that are given to US soldiers as they prepare to fight in Manila, and it's true. They say Filipinos are friendly, but at no point do they indicate that there's any relationship between the Philippines and the United States. It's as if the Philippines, at least in those pamphlets and in the soldiers' mind, is a foreign country. The Philippines does get its independence quickly, as promised, on July 4th, 1946. And it's not the only US territory that sort of decolonizes in one way or another. Alaska and Hawaii in 1959 become states, so that's 3 of the 4 largest colonies that the United States holds. In my book, I tell about how the United States tilts away from a colonial empire, where claiming large colonies, to what I call a pointillist empire, where the United States has a lot of territory today, but it's just a lot of little dots. This is a map of known US military bases. Overall, the United States has hundreds of foreign military bases, just little enclaves where the US flag flies or where US troops can land. We think about 800 bases, depending on how you count. But I want to end by talking not about the pointillist empire and these bases, which I discuss at length in the book, but just by giving you sort of one last reminder of how important the legacy of colonialism is. It's a moment in US history that we rarely talk about in these terms, but it's the 2008 election. So let's break it down. John McCain is the Republican contender. He's born in the Panama Canal zone. He's a Zonian. He leaves quickly, so it's not part of his identity, but it's on his legal rap sheet. And that matters a lot because, okay, there's a law that says, at the time McCain is born, there's a law that says if you are born outside of the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the United States to citizen parents, you're a US citizen. But McCain is not born outside of the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the United States. He's born in the Panama Canal zone. There's also a law, you might have heard of it, it's called the 14th Amendment, that says if you're born in the United States, you're a US citizen. But the Supreme Court clarified that that law doesn't, actually the Constitution doesn't apply to all US territories, it just applies to part of the United States, the mainland in Alaska and Hawaii, and so actually that also does not cover the Panama Canal Zone. Legislators in the 1930s saw this, recognized it as a serious loophole, and realized that children born to citizen parents in the Panama Canal Zone were not covered by any citizenship law, and they argued about this. Should they be covered or not? They had a debate. And in 1937, they passed a law saying, okay, if you're born to a citizen parent in the Panama Canal Zone, you're a citizen. And that law applied retroactively. So if you had been born in these circumstances, you were now, per this law, a US citizen. And this matters because you have to be, to be president, you have to be a natural-born citizen. The Supreme Court has never clarified what that means, but it seems like you should be a citizen at the time of your birth. Anyway, that law passes in 1937. John McCain's born in 1936. He's born a year before that law. So arguably, John McCain is not eligible, was not eligible to be president. Some of this gets hashed out, but I think the full legal case was not really appreciated during his campaign, or only at the end of it by an enterprising legal scholar who uncovered all the details. This isn't even the end of McCain's empire woes. His running mate, Sarah Palin, she's not born in Alaska. She's born in the mainland, but she moves as a baby to Alaska, and then she grows up, falls in love with someone who is born in Alaska, Todd Palin, and they get married. Todd Palin's Yupik Indian. He's an Alaska native, part Alaska native, but that's legally part of who he is. And actually their children are legally Alaska natives as well, and have the kind of rights and privileges that come with it. This is actually part of how Sarah Palin identifies. When she's running for governor of Alaska, she makes a lot of the fact that her family is mixed, native and non-native. And this is her wearing, just in an everyday kind of way, wearing the kuspuk, which is something that Yupiks wear customarily in Alaska, and actually a lot of Alaskans do. But this comes up for her in a different way, because it's not only is Todd Palin an Alaska native, Todd Palin is also a member of the Alaska Independence Party, which argues that the plebiscite for statehood that was held in Alaska was illegitimate because many Alaska natives couldn't vote for literacy reasons, whereas a lot of men stationed on bases could. And so the vote for statehood was illegitimate. Alaska needs another vote, and ideally a vote that would lead to independence, not to statehood. Todd Palin is a member of this party. Sarah Palin has attended conventions with him. This also is surmountable. For McCain, it's amazing to me that this is not more of an issue. But for both, McCain is the children of, he's a war hero, he's a military child. Sarah Palin is a fierce defender of what she calls the real America. But there is someone to whom these kind of issues do stick, which is their opponent, Barack Obama. Barack Obama is born in Hawaii. He's born slightly after Hawaii becomes a state, so he doesn't have the McCain problem. Hawaii has, actually even more than Alaska, a really serious sovereignty movement grounded in indigenous politics. But Barack Obama, unlike Sarah Palin, doesn't engage with it, so he doesn't have the Palin problem. But nevertheless, largely because he's from Hawaii, he has the kind of complex multiracial background that a lot of people in Hawaii have. Here's Barack Obama at his sister's wedding, and you just get a sense of all the various strains that go into making the Obama family. And this comes up in the election. It comes up first in the primary, where his opponent, Hillary Clinton, well, her chief strategist, Mark Penn, gives her a memo saying, look, this guy is not fundamentally American, and I can't imagine in a time of war that, really the voting public really wants to elect someone who's not fundamentally American. Ms. Clinton, you should double down on this. Every speech you give, you should say, I was born in the middle of the century, in the middle of America, implicitly, and my opponent can't say that. Hillary Clinton, to her great credit, rejects this advice. She refuses to do it. But nevertheless, her supporters, after Barack Obama wins the primary, her supporters start to fantasize that he would be disqualified, and that she would then, be the candidate, disqualified because he's not a natural-born citizen. They start to circulate rumors that he's not an American. He doesn't fulfill the natural-born citizen clause. Those rumors start among Clinton supporters. They hot party lines and take on an even larger life among Republicans. And we often talk about birtherism as sort of anti-black racism, and clearly that's some of it. But I just want to point out, there's a lot of African-American political figures in the United States. They don't usually get accused of not having been born in the United States. This is a particular kind of attack, and it has a lot to do with where Barack Obama was born, in a part of the United States that's not part of the mainland, that's not on the logo map, that is still in a lot of people's minds, part of the United States with an asterisk. This issue keeps going, and in fact, it becomes the entry point for Donald Trump into presidential politics. So just take a second to kind of zoom out. Barack Obama, John McCain, Sarah Palin, Donald Trump, every single one of these figures in recent past has been touched in a deep way by the enduring politics of colonialism, which is just a reminder that if you want to do U.S. history, if you want to think about the United States, you can't just think of the mainland, you have to understand the greater United States. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take some questions. You want to field questions?
I'm sure you have a ton of questions. Just a reminder that we do have microphones on the other side. Please wait for the microphone if you would, and Professor, I'll let you call your own questions.
Yeah. We've got a mic coming.
I'd like to hear you comment on the effects of the Philippine insurrection, that war that we fought in the Philippines, on this image of a hidden empire, because during that period it wasn't very well hidden from the American people.
That's true. Okay, so it's not just that the United States annexed the Philippines. It fought a war starting in 1899 and going kind of till 1913. It was an extremely long war to pacify the Philippines. That war killed, we think, some 750,000 people, mainly from disease, not from combat, but boy, did a lot of them die from disease. It seems like that war killed more people than the U.S. Civil War, another war of secession that happened on U.S. territory. And that was a moment, you're absolutely right. That was a moment of visibility, but I think it was also a moment when the kind of enthusiasm that had led to this sort of cartographic innovation was sapped. Even the sort of defenders of imperialism and the eager annexationists, people like Teddy Roosevelt, by 1904 or such, really haven't got much more energy for this kind of thing. And I think that war contributes to the United States' shift away from, instead of gleefully annexing more places, which it had the opportunity to do, to taking not as many more places. It bought the U.S. Virgin Islands, later claimed the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, but rather to sort of revert to itself, be like, okay, maybe empire wasn't such a great idea, revert to its self-image as a republic, and then kind of sweep the colonies under the rug. So I think that war actually plays an important role in that. Yeah, sure.
So why in 1898 did the United States not annex Cuba?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of questions about where the United States would annex in 1898. Because there's a fight between imperialists and anti-imperialists. And there are a lot of anti-imperialists in Congress. And they are nervous about U.S. entry in the war, nervous that this is going to mean empire. And so they managed to pass an amendment to the war resolution saying, okay, the United States can go to war with Spain, but it cannot annex Cuba. They are not expecting the Philippines. But this is a moment of sort of possibility for the United States. It's possible to imagine that that didn't pass. It's possible to imagine that the United States would have just taken a coaling station, near Manila, not taken the entire Philippines. Another question is, why does the United States only take Guam instead of all Spanish Micronesia? Places the United States would fight bitterly over in World War II and would later annex. But the people making these decisions have not a lot of information and are making them in a fairly arbitrary way. So the Cuba, I can certainly imagine a version of the past in which Cuba becomes U.S. territory. I can also imagine a version when the Philippines doesn't. We've got some questions over here. Yeah.
Let's turn to Puerto Rico.
Please.
We wound up with Puerto Rico as a territory, I guess, in the unwinding of the Spanish-American War. Is that correct?
Yeah, Puerto Rico becomes U.S. territory in that war, yeah.
And I understand that people born in Puerto Rico are American citizens.
They were not originally, so citizenship is a constitutional right by the 14th Amendment. In the territories, it's statutory. It happens by law, and Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens for more than 100 years, but that's because of a law that got passed during World War I.
And yet, Puerto Rico remains our colony. I know there's been movements to enter it into the Union, and a lot of blowback and pressure against that.
Yeah.
And it remains our colony. 2 years ago, Puerto Rico had a great disaster.
Yes.
A hurricane. And it left the islands in shambles. The United States has sort of taken a hands-off approach to helping Puerto Rico fix itself.
Yes.
Are we treating it like a colony, or are we treating it like a wastebasket?
So here's an important thing to recognize. The United States has 5 inhabited territories today. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. In the last 2 years, 4 of the 5 have faced existential crises. It's not just Puerto Rico. It's also the U.S. Virgin Islands, which was struck by a hurricane, Hurricane Irma, right before. You might not have heard of Typhoon U2, which hit in the winter. It's actually the strongest storm that has hit the United States since the 1930s, decimated Saipan and Tinian in the northern Marianas, barely made a dent in the news here on the mainlands. And then Guam was threatened, and kind of credibly threatened, by North Korea, which threatened to sort of surround it with an enveloping fire. That's 4 out of the 5 inhabited territories of the United States. And that's just a reminder that these places are going to continue to be on the front lines of history, and often, with climate change and fraying U.S. alliances, probably face unique peril. But at the same time, these places can't vote for president. They can send delegates to Congress. They can vote on delegates, and those delegates go to Congress. And as of the present Congress in the House, those delegates can vote with a single caveat. Delegates from the territories can vote. However, if their vote proves decisive, there's a revote without them. And the territories are also not covered by the Constitution. So in every 3 branches of government, the territories are in some ways subordinated or disenfranchised. And I think that goes a long way to explaining why the President administration can sort of unabashedly say it is really important to give hurricane relief to Florida, it is really important to give it to Texas, we'd like not to give it to Puerto Rico. Just the structure of government gets you part of the way to understanding why Puerto Rico can be treated in this way, which is very different from how other U.S. citizens are treated. Yeah.
This is a little bit as an aside, but when you began, you said that the United States kind of got involved in a war that Spain was fighting. Who was Spain fighting, or was it an internal civil war with these colonies fighting Madrid?
Yeah, so often as it's narrated, the Spanish-American War in 1898 is a tidy little affair in which the United States, absolutely destroys Spain and then just has its pick of Spain's colonies. Another way to say it, and the way that I would prefer to say it, is that Spain had been fighting its colonial subjects, had been facing a sort of empire-wide revolution, particularly in Cuba and the Philippines, where this stuff had been going on for decades, but it really culminated in a complete imperial crisis in the last couple of years. Also, to some degree, in Puerto Rico. The United States, so it's not, and the United States enters as a sort of supplying a decisive burst of force at the end of what had already been a very long and exhausting conflict. So it's not really the Spanish-American War, it's kind of the Spanish, Cuban, Filipino, Puerto Rican American War, but that's who Spain is fighting, and that's part of why the United States is able to defeat Spain so readily. Is that Spain is already on the ropes because it's fighting, throughout its empire. Yeah. Yes, sir.
A question: how do you address the District of Columbia?
Yes. Since publishing this book, I have heard from people who want to talk DC. And I thought about, DC is look, it's just a reminder that the name of the country, the United States of America, rings a little hollow when you actually think, there are actually a lot of important places in the United States that aren't states. DC, Ellis Island, which is this weird kind of half foreign, half domestic place, as well as the territories, the military bases. DC, it's clear that DC suffers from some, not all, of the same deprivations that the overseas territories do, and it's clear that there's a sort of racial overlay to that as well in D.C. I'm going to meet with soon the shadow senator from D.C., where we'll talk about this. But I didn't include D.C. in my book, partly because I did see a sort of important qualitative distinction between the kind of historical experience that the overseas parts of the United States have and the kind that other subordinated domestic spaces have. We could also mention, and should mention, by the way, Native American reservations, which also sort of interrupt the fabric of a sort of homogeneous legal uniform space within the U.S. mainland. And, yeah.
So over time, obviously, we made some places states and chose not to make other places states.
Yeah.
And so I was just curious from your perspective in research, as far as what was the United States litmus test for deciding which of these territories were going to become states, which ones were not? Was it arbitrary? Was there certain, blowbacks that they sensed would occur if they tried to make the mistake? Could you talk just a little bit generally about that process?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that the United States is, from day one, from the day when the United States gets the independence treaty from Britain ratified, it is already a union of states and territories. And some of those territories, even on the mainland, remain territories for a long time. The average state or territory to statehood transition on the mainland, 45 years. Oklahoma, more than a century before Oklahoma becomes a state, between when the majority of it is annexed and when it becomes a state. What determines when a place becomes a state? By the Northwest Ordinance, which sort of sets the law that kind of sets the pattern, it's the presence of white population. And that is the organizing decisive factor throughout the history of territory to statehood transitions. It's the places that have large and dominant white populations can be admitted. There's also the confounding fact of the sort of north-south tension, and there's states that are held back and states that are promoted in order to keep a political balance. But that's mainly it. Hawaii is actually really interesting because it is the first state that breaks that is admitted, that is really not obviously under the control of a white population. And the first congressional delegation that Hawaii sends forth includes the first Chinese-American senator, the first Japanese-American congressman. But even still, Hawaii is significantly whiter, according to U.S. racial logics, than other U.S. territories, and that explains a lot why it can be promoted to statehood. Yeah.
This is kind of a left-wing take, but do you have a take on the subject of gerrymandering, the art of carving up counties for political gain?
No. Good question. Yeah.
Hey, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
I have a question. Do you have any insight throughout this period about mainland Americans who then move overseas to these places?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking primarily of missionaries and merchants. Do
Yeah.
they comment differently on whether these places belong than mainlanders do?
A really interesting feature of the U.S. empire is it doesn't have as much of that as other empires. There's not as much traffic from the mainland. Often, for example, there's no trained colonial civil service. There's no academy that you can go to train for a career in the colonies. There are missionaries and educators who go out to these places, and I've read some of their memoirs, but it's not as much as you see in the British Empire, in the French Empire, in the Dutch Empire. The people who really have this experience, the mainlanders who really spend a lot of time in these places, are military folks. And in fact, when I told people on the mainland that I was writing this book, a common reaction I got, if people didn't have family in Puerto Rico or on Guam, is they say, I really don't know a lot about these places. But if I talked to someone who had served in the military, they were like, I know all about all of these places. And the one person who comes out in my book as sort of having the strongest affective ties to at least one colony in particular, the Philippines, is Douglas MacArthur. His father had been the governor general of it. He'd spent some of his youth there. It was the first place he saw combat. It's where he met his second wife. His child is born there. Manuel Quezon is the godfather of that child. Douglas MacArthur kind of feels Filipino in a lot of ways. And he's actually really interesting in that respect because he becomes, during World War II and before it, a rare voice within the U.S. mainland among the leadership, really demanding the full colonial defense of the Philippines, which he argues is just as integral as the United States as New York is. That's exactly how he puts it. But folks like MacArthur are, well, deeply weird, but also people like MacArthur are rare. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I have a cold. To what extent do you think local identity sort of plays a role in keeping these places hidden? I'm thinking of the Philippines. Does a local national identity prevent Filipinos from thinking of themselves as belonging to a greater America?
Yeah, right. How do people in the colonies identify? Well, first, I'll note one thing. If on the mainlands, it can be hard to see the fact of empire. The overseas parts of the United States can be hard to see. You don't see the maps with Puerto Rico on it. From the territories, the fact of U.S. sovereignty is impossible to miss. It's from the flags, from the coins, the bills, just there's all, from the language of instruction in schools. There's all kinds of ways, and just at a daily, all sorts of daily reminders of what country you're living in if you're living in Puerto Rico. However, there's also a long history of resistance to that fact, to the fact of U.S. sovereignty. That's true in Hawaii, that's true in Puerto Rico, that's true in Guam. And identity is a complex matter. It's not just about, what Puerto Ricans want is not just a matter of rights and sort of economic gains. It's also a matter of who people think they are. It's complicated is the answer. But there certainly are, like, for example, the language I use is I say, all of this stuff here is the United States, right? That's all legally part of the United States. And when we're thinking as historians, we should think about the United States as looking like this. I will sometimes hear from Puerto Ricans who say, what are you talking about? Puerto Rico is not part of the United States. And to say that Puerto Rico is part of the United States is to legitimate the illegal colonization of Puerto Rico that's been going on since 1899. It is important for me, a Puerto Rican, to distinguish Puerto Rico from the United States as a way of rejecting the U.S. claims of sovereignty. So you sort of put your finger on a really important issue, and that may play some role, right? The fact that not everyone in Puerto Rico or Guam is insisting on taking the identity of American in the same way that mainlanders do, that may also play some role in making it hard to see from the perspective of the mainland.
Two quick points. The new pointillism that you've got out there. I was a career military officer. My son was born in Nuremberg in a military installation. He had to be naturalized. He could never, which is really a bad situation. Second of all, going to the Puerto Rican thing, it's between Commonwealth, statehood, and independence. I am persona non grata. I'm persona non grata in Puerto Rico for the work I did in the government for the U.S. government there, these things go very, very deep on all three issues, and it can be fatal in some cases.
Yeah, look, folks in Puerto Rico have really strong opinions about this, right? And get in loud arguments with each other about should Puerto Rico be a state, should Puerto Rico be independent, should it continue to be a Commonwealth, should the Commonwealth Constitution be adjusted in some way? And of course they do, right? This stuff, of course this stuff is both deeply meaningful and really complicated. And you're right. These politics are passionately felt in Puerto Rico.
I want to ask kind of a historiographical question, which is rare for me. Going back to the period of 1898 and that jumping off point, one of the long-standing New Left interpretations, which I was weaned on, was that the whole purpose of the Pacific expansion had nothing to do with the Pacific. It was all to get to mainland Asia. It was all to get to China. I'm curious, this actually fits very well with your narrative, I think, in the sense that these places, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, are not necessarily important in and of themselves. They're important as something else. They're important as stepping stones. They're important as jumping off points. I'm curious, now that it's, 70 years since that interpretation was first put out, how does it stand up?
So that interpretation is associated with William Appleman Williams' Tragedy of American Diplomacy, published in 1959. We are now chronologically further away from that than that was from the Philippine War. It's true. It's true that the champions of empire, especially Teddy Roosevelt, envisioned the territorial empire as allowing the United States to extend its reach, to extend its commerce to Asia, to China, to Japan. It doesn't really work. The Philippines doesn't become an economically indispensable colony in itself. It's not like great rubber plantations that grow in the Philippines. Also, U.S. trade with Japan and China doesn't explode as a result of the U.S. sort of, conquest of parts of the Pacific. And that's part of the reason why, especially combined with the Philippine War, why a lot of champions of empire start to lose their enthusiasm into the early 20th century, and the maps start looking different. But just in the same way that a couple can fall out of love but remain married, a country can grow less imperialistic but remain an empire. So even after the ostensible, main use of these places has proved to be, not as useful or not as profitable or not as easily accessible as folks like Teddy Roosevelt had hoped, that doesn't make the Philippines any less of a colony. It just puts the Philippines in this weird position of being a kind of neglected place. And it turns out that neglect can be just as painful as exploitation. Yeah.
Was the whole country of Panama a territory? Just the Canal Zone was where is that? I mean, I know we created Panama, correct?
Yeah. So the United States was hoping for a canal, and it easily Teddy Roosevelt sort of encouraged Panamanian rebels to declare independence and then give the United States control over a canal zone that bisects the country. So you actually cannot travel through Panama without going through the Panama Canal Zone. And it's even more complicated than that. So Panama was never a U.S. colony. Panama Canal Zone is U.S. jurisdiction. It's a U.S. lease. But the lease gives the United States all the power of a sovereign. So it's not quite U.S. territory, but it appears on the U.S. Census. And this isn't that unusual. This is actually similar to what you see in Guantanamo Bay. There are a lot of places where this sort of half-in, half-out nebulous legal space, I mean, that's something you see frequently in empire. And it's not a surprise that John McCain gets himself into a legal loophole, because a lot of these spaces function as kind of standing legal loopholes, and often that allows the United States to kind of do whatever it wants with these places. One of the reasons why Guantanamo Bay becomes so valuable to the George W. Bush administration is it's seen as a place where the United States has full jurisdiction, but not sovereignty. So what happens there is ostensibly, this is the idea, can't come up in federal courts, but nevertheless the United States will control it. So there's empire has a lot of these kind of halfway spaces, and the Panama Canal Zone is one of them. One more question, right in the center there.
Where are we relative to the teaching of history relative to what you brought forth today? I think a lot of this was somewhat repressed in terms of many of us that were going through American history.
Yeah.
And I'm curious where it is today and what it might take, notwithstanding your text, to see it opened up to have a broader view of the empire.
I'm so glad you asked. Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that we have a lot of hard-hitting scholars who for decades, but especially recently, have been doing a lot of work on this stuff. So we are learning more and more. The stories are coming just into focus with great clarity. It's easier to talk about this stuff because we've had people sort of burrowing through all the boxes, and that's the really good news. The bad news is that textbooks can be sticky, and partly because they're governed not just by the whims of their authors, who are often professional historians who might be reading some of that literature, but they're governed by states who set the standards and who decide what it is to learn U.S. history. So I've gone through a number of mainland textbooks looking for just key events or episodes that would seem to me to be highly relevant to the telling of U.S. history once you get the full thing in view, and have been consistently frustrated by not seeing them. The reason that I wanted to write my book the way I did, I tried to write it as a book directed not just at my fellow scholars, but to the public, was just to be able to say, please look, like this is the story you get. Look at how U.S. history changes, year to year. See all the ways in which the familiar stories that you know suddenly become unfamiliar or take on new aspects once you get the greater United States in view. And that's probably a good reminder for me to advertise. Copies are for sale in the lobby.
Well, I think the annual just gave the best advertisement possible, so listen to what he said.